As the 21st century develops, it will become increasingly apparent that we all need to learn more about India and what India represents in our modern world. But we would also do well to learn from India, with India, and ideally in India. Why is that? Well, first of all, let me start by sharing a few reasons why I think we need to learn more about India. One thing which makes India important is its sheer scale. Today, 1/6 of all the human beings on the planet are Indian. India's population is now more than 1.3 billion. And by 2022, according to the UN, there will be more people living in India than any other country in the world. Take a look at this map. This is how we normally think of the world. It's the map we are all familiar with. But look what happens when we change the size of the countries to match up with the size of their populations. This cartogram was created by Mark Newman at the University of Michigan, and it's a really clever way to readjust our perception of the world in which we live. On the normal map, India barely registers, but by looking at this one, you can't help but see how important India is, just in population terms compared to the rest of the world. India has 4 times the population of the US. There are more Indians than North Americans and Europeans put together. More people live in India than the whole of Africa. In fact, 1/6 of the world's population lives here. And for further context, 1 in 8 people on planet Earth live in rural India. According to the UN, India's population growth rate means it will overtake China as the world's most populous country in 6 years' time. And it's forecast to be the largest country for the rest of the 21st century. In terms of land area, India is also a very large country. At 1.3 million square miles, it's the 7th largest in the world. But that's just 1/3 the size of America and only 1/10 the size of Africa. This means that India has one of the world's highest population densities, about 1,000 people per square mile. That's 3 times more densely populated than China and 12 times more densely populated than the US. India's enormous population means that it faces many challenges as a low-income country. Now, last year, the UN member states adopted a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals for the year 2030. And these 17 goals were then divided into a whopping 169 different targets. Each of them is relevant to India, which means that India is relevant to the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. The scale of ambition that the UN has set out is obviously enormous. To end poverty, end hunger, end inequality, ensure access to education, healthcare, clean water and sanitation, to provide productive employment and economic growth, to conserve the natural environment, and so on. Now, India is very much aware of all these goals and knows that to meet them and improve the quality of life for Indian people, it has some of the greatest challenges in the world to overcome. Just look at this cartogram of countries by their share of the world child mortality rate to see why India is so important. If we are to live in a more equal world, where every human has the chance to live a long, healthy and productive life, then how India meets its sustainable development goals is going to be extremely important. To meet the sustainable development goals, it will be hard to find one-size-fits-all solutions for India because of India's heterogeneity. This makes India a much more complex place to operate in and to design and deliver solutions, products and services for, regardless of whether these are for-profit or not-for-profit, by government agencies, corporates and even startups. There's always more to learn about India because of this diversity, because of the difference, because of the complexity, which is one of the reasons why we've themed the later weeks the way we have. So before we go any further, we have to realise just how often when we're talking about India, generalisations simply won't work. The Cambridge economist Joan Robinson once said many years ago that whatever you can rightly say about India, the opposite is also true. Her own generalisation has become widely popularised by the Indian Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen. Just consider India's geography. Not even America can compete with a country which stretches from the glaciers and snows of the highest mountains in the world in its north, all the way down to the tropical beaches and jungles of the south. We'll help you appreciate this and India's cultural diversity in week 3. Of course, another feature of India which is familiar to many outsiders, at least vaguely, is the incredible diversity in wealth and income. India is known for its slums, for the people who live in the poorest parts of the rural countryside. But it's also home to some of the richest people in the world. There are 700 million farmers in rural India, 300 million of whom are desperately poor. But as the country's wealth grows, it also has a large and very fast-growing middle class. We're going to look at India's socioeconomic pyramid a little bit later this week. As we'll see in the next section, India is certainly set to have a massive influence on the world economy and on the already shifting balance of geopolitics, including taking a leadership role in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, as exemplified by Prime Minister Modi's speech at the UN when they were launched in September last year. In week 5, you'll learn how India's diversity is actually an amazing enabler of creativity, as different ideas arise out of different contexts and combinations. Since India is also, unlike China, a democratic country which believes in free enterprise, free speech, firewall-free internet, and therefore the free exchange of ideas, its diversity also generates a keen sense of competition with different states, regions and communities comparing each other, learning from each other, and challenging each other. It is precisely because India is so vibrant, energetic, diverse, and has so many people, including some extremely clever people, that it's going to be an amazing source of ideas, of inventions and solutions to those problems which will be needed by other countries and people all over the world, not just in other developing countries facing similar challenges, but also to those countries already developed, such as Europe and America. At this point, I think we need to bring up the big C word. People talk about Indian civilization. What does this really mean? I find it useful to think of a civilization as an enormous conversation, stretching back through time, covering countless subjects through many mediums: oral storytelling, the written word, paintings, sculpture, movies, architecture, music, so on. For me, the most important common connection between the diverse cultures of India, past, present and future, is the way that they have participated in a common conversation. The world is home to many of these great conversations, but there are really 3 which are particularly significant in terms of their longevity, their breadth, their continuity and their influence. These are the ones which have been developing for millennia, what we call in the broader sense of that word, the West, China and India. The Great Western Conversation began as far back as the cities of Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. It developed through ancient Greece and Rome, through the Jews, through the rise of Christianity and Islam, whose scholars, let's not forget, rediscovered Greek knowledge and introduced Persian and Indian knowledge to the Western conversation through projects like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad between the 9th and 13th centuries. Then there was a great flowering of medieval and Renaissance Europe, the Enlightenment, and finally modern civilization in both Europe and, of course, America. This is the story, Eurocentric story, with which many of us have grown up with, and we're most familiar with this Western story. It's also the story that during British rule, educated Indians were taught because of the way the universities and the education system was run. But what we have only become more aware of in the past few hundred years is that great conversations have been carrying on for just as long and between the countries of the East. We are now living in what Nietzsche called the age of comparison, where knowledge from all cultures is available to all cultures. We should make the most of it and have a truly global conversation on equal terms. And that means, above all, giving due credit and taking renewed interest in the Indian conversation, and for that matter, the Chinese. Later in week 2, we shall be looking at the extraordinary influence of India, not just on China, but also on our own great conversation in the West. A useful analogy for these conversations is that of a great flowing river, like America's Mississippi or China's Yangtze or India's Ganges. These rivers have many tributaries feeding into them and distributaries feeding out in their deltas. Since Islam first arrived in India 1200 years ago, it has had a huge impact on the Indian conversation. New forms of Islam emerged and an entirely new religion, Sikhism. Muslim culture has had a huge influence on everything from food, kebabs, to music, Sufi Qawwali, to architecture, the Taj Mahal, and much else in India. But the Indian conversation also flowed westwards into the rest of the Muslim world, as when it brought with it the system of numerals, which was to become the basis for the whole of modern mathematics and therefore modern science. And equally, as we shall see, the Indian conversation has had far greater influence on the Western conversation than is widely realised. From the influence of Indian philosophy on some of the leading figures in the 19th century European Romantic movement, and the American transcendentalists like Thoreau, Emerson, Margaret Fuller and Walt Whitman, to the great quantum physicists of the 20th century, and of course the spread of hippie culture across the West in the 1960s, and the enthusiasm for yoga and meditation, which is still with us today and shows no sign of decreasing. Whilst this has sometimes been inspired by gurus or teachers from India, it has normally come through translations of Indian texts, philosophies, poetry, literature, into English, French or German. But of course the interaction with the West was very much two-way. For much of the past 2,000 years, India itself was heavily influenced by the fact that much of it was under foreign rule from representatives of the Western conversation. We've touched on the influence that Islam has had on India during the 1200 years when Muslims have been present in India, and especially during the 600 years when India was under Muslim rule. But then for 300 more years came the British, giving a huge injection of the Western conversation into Indian life, as British values and institutions came to play such an important role in the ruling consciousness of India, much of which survives to this day. One of the legacies is, of course, the English language, which is an official language of India and is also used regularly as the bridge language between different Indian languages. A Tamil speaker from the south and a Hindi speaker from the north are much more likely to understand each other by speaking English than they are to speak in either of their mother tongues. Another great legacy of the colonial era, and the topic of much controversy even today, is the identity and ideology of the scholars of the Indian tradition. Incredible as it may sound, much of the academic scholarship on Indian civilization, its philosophy, literature, religion and so on, is dominated not by Indians in India, but by Westerners, British, German and now largely American, or Indians educated by them in the West. I think it is very important for us to realise that India's own conversation remains an enormous reservoir, an untapped reservoir of knowledge and inspiration, from which we can all learn both directly and indirectly. For instance, world science in the 21st century is increasingly interested in the human brain, the mind and consciousness. Now, Indians have been thinking about the nature of consciousness far longer than anyone else, and they've been experimenting with it and recording, documenting their experiences. As Western scientists such as the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung in the early 20th century, and also the Nobel Prize-winning nuclear physicists have shown, there is a great deal that India has to teach about such things. I personally think that the UN's very name for its 2030 goals agenda, sustainable development, could be added as one of the many translations we can use to try and explain the idea behind the Sanskrit, the Indian term dharma. Indian scholar Prasenjit Dwara has written an excellent recent work drawing in part from the Indian Dharmic tradition on ideas for resolving what he calls the crisis of global modernity and how we might establish a more sustainable future for humanity. It's not just Indian concepts that we would do well to learn from. The leading medical journal, The Lancet, once described oral rehydration therapy, a way of replacing fluid lost due to dehydration, as the most important medical advance of the 20th century. Over the last 40 years, it's estimated that ORT has saved over 40 million lives. And in fact, this was directly inspired, the discovery of ORT was directly inspired by a traditional Indian technique for curing diarrhea, probably practiced here for thousands of years. It was only discovered in the West in the 1950s and 60s, following the publication of research by a Bengali doctor, Hemendranath Chatterjee. This Indian idea was quite contrary to the Western scientific consensus of the time, but it worked. It also may have inspired the invention of Louisiana State University's Bengal Punch sports drink, which could be a play on Bengal tigers and the Bengali inspiration. And indirectly, perhaps even the University of Florida's world-famous Gatorade. Less directly, we can learn from the Indian conversation by learning new stories, patterns, and insights, which can then in turn inspire creativity and innovation. The American professor of cognitive science, Douglas Hofstadter, has said that analogy, seeing the comparisons between one thing and another, is the fuel and fire of human thinking, the core of cognitive thinking. It therefore follows that when exposed to new things, even if they are not directly relevant or even are wrong, but they can create new connections, and this can lead to important discoveries. A wonderful example of this is one with which we're all familiar, the periodic table, which groups all the world's chemical elements into certain categories. The genius who created the version of this that we all know was the 19th century Russian chemist Dmitry Mendeleev. What is less well known is the fact that the inspiration behind the structure of the table came from him studying the alphabet of the ancient Indian language Sanskrit. Mendeleev perceived from the way that the letters were grouped in the Sanskrit Varnamala, the Sanskrit alphabet, that the chemical elements of which all things are made could be grouped together according to their properties in a similar way, in 2 dimensions. It was a perfect example of inspiration by analogy. And in a nod to his inspiration, Mendeleev named the gaps in the table by using prefixes eka, dvai, and tri from the Sanskrit words for 1, 2, and 3, rather than say Latin, Greek, or his native Russian. His prediction that there was an element with certain properties that he called eka-silicon was confirmed when what we now call germanium was discovered, proving his theory. And a number of other elements that he predicted because of this were subsequently discovered. The Sri Lankan scientist Susanta Gunatilak wrote a fascinating book, Toward a Global Science, which makes a strong case for the value of learning from Indian civilization and the impact that can have on science, directly and indirectly as a source of new metaphors which can help us see problems in a new light. And we shouldn't just be limited to learning about India and from India. It has never been easier to learn with India. And dare I say it, this course is a great start. So please use the discussion forums here to begin learning together and also use all of the further resources and links that we provide between the lessons. You may be surprised to know that the Indians of today are so keen on learning that they make up the 2nd largest user base on Coursera. So if you are Indian and you are watching this, thank you very much, and please do join in the conversation. The popular question and answer site Quora may be based in Silicon Valley, but it is incredibly popular in India, even though it was not designed with the Indian audience in mind. More than 1/3 of all the Quora users are Indian. 2 more great examples of how Indians are using the internet to learn and therefore providing opportunities for us to learn together, how coders from America and India help each other, and the rest of the world, help each other work through problems on sites like Stack Overflow and GitHub. In fact, many young Americans have the opportunity to learn with Indians on campus in America because more than 130,000 Indians are now studying in the US. And last year, that number increased by 29.4%. Americans today increasingly have Indian peers due to the globally connected workforce. Millions of Indians are working with Americans every day, both physically in the same offices, in hospitals, in universities, in laboratories, and virtually across the internet through outsourcing. Of course, the best way to learn about, from, and with India is by coming to India. There really is no substitute for experiencing India firsthand. No book, documentary, movie, or MOOC can help you learn about and from this amazing country and with its amazing people, as much as you can if you come here, whether it's just to travel or better still to study and intern. Fortunately, it has never been easier, and there are so many opportunities for young Americans to come to India. Many US universities now run study abroad programs in India or have exchange agreements with India's top universities. Many Indian institutions are also open to foreign students, including the prestigious IITs, and are increasingly running programs especially for international students. Companies and NGOs are also keen to have international interns join their teams in India, including American companies like Intel, Microsoft, and Indian ones like Infosys, TCS, and Mu Sigma. Many of these positions are even paid, and some of the India-based programs are actually designed to lead on to full-time jobs back in the US. What better way to gain experience for the 21st century and make your resume truly stand out than interning at a company in India? We'll be talking more about these opportunities in week 6, and you can in fact find a directory of over 75 programs and internship positions on the Passport to India website.